The story begins with a man named Frank Perry, who is imprisoned and lost deep in thought. From the expression on his face, it's clear he's about to do something he has never done before. A while later, Frank leaves his room and heads straight to the cell of the most dangerous inmate in the prison, Riza. Meanwhile, in the prison laundry room, 4 inmates are busy executing their escape plan. They quickly remove a drain cover and dig a hole in the ground, climbing down one by one. But Bree waits behind for a while, hoping for his close friend Frank to show up. In reality, the whole escape plan was supposed to include Frank, but at the last minute, Lacey shows up instead. After waiting a bit more for his friend, Broad finally jumps down into the hole, but he forgets his cap behind. Some time later, Frank arrives at the spot, badly injured. Without wasting time, he picks up Broad's cap and jumps into the hole. A few months earlier, Frank was living an ordinary life inside the prison, just like the other inmates. His job was to wash clothes in the prison laundry room. Frank had accepted this life to a large extent, since he was serving a life sentence and had no hope of ever getting out. So, accepting the prison as his whole world was the only option he had. He spent most of his time alone, and kept his distance from the most feared inmate, Riza. Over time, Frank had made a few friends. One day, when he returned to his room after finishing work, he saw his cellmate packing his stuff. His sentence was over, and he was finally going home. Elsewhere, other inmates were gathered to catch a glimpse of the new batch of prisoners. The newcomers were being brought in, covered in an antibacterial powder. Except for their underwear, they were completely naked. Among the happiest to see this was Tony, Riz's brother. He had been in prison so long that loving men didn't bother him anymore. In fact, he enjoyed teasing the new inmates. His eyes locked onto a new prisoner named Lacey. A while later, all the inmates were sent to their cells, and Lacey ended up being Frank's new cellmate. Frank, however, wasn't particularly interested in him. When Lacey tried to make conversation, Frank simply ignored him. That evening, Frank received a letter. For the past 14 years, Frank had been writing letters to his family in hopes that one day, his daughter would reply. But he never received a single response, and the letter he got today was from his wife. It said that their daughter had been hospitalized due to a drug overdose and could die at any moment. The moment Frank read this, his world turned upside down. The person he loved the most was now standing at death's door. This truth began to eat him alive. Shortly after, Frank went to the prison chapel. Seeing his condition, a guard opened the door for him even at such a late hour. Frank entered the confession booth, pulled out the letter, and started crying uncontrollably. Now, no matter what, he wanted to see his daughter one last time. The next morning, while working in the laundry room, Frank noticed the metal mesh behind a washing machine. Just above it were some pipes that led outside the prison. This observation sparked a major idea in Frank's mind. Later, he met his closest friend Broad and asked him whether the air vents in the machines were connected to the prison's sewer system. Hearing such a question from Frank, Broad was shocked at first. But then Frank showed him the letter from his wife. After reading it, Broad understood why Frank was so desperate to escape. Frank needed help, and Broad had experience digging tunnels. He had dug one before beneath the prison. After some thought, Broad agreed to help, as he too was serving a life sentence. A few days later, Frank met a dangerous boxer named Lenny, who was actually supposed to be out on parole. But because of Frank's previous cellmate snitching on him, his parole had been cancelled. Now he was burning with rage and thirsting for revenge, something Frank planned to use to his advantage. Frank told Lenny about the escape plan. Lenny was an expert with tools, which could be very useful. At first, he resisted, but after some thought, he agreed. After that, Frank met with his other 2 partners. While pretending to play a game, they discussed the plan. They had only one escape route, through the laundry room. But to get there, they had to pass through 3 secure doors. Frank, however, had a backup plan. When Frank was in the confession booth, he noticed the walls of the room were quite thin. According to him, they could break through the wall of the booth and enter the laundry room from there. From there, they would break into the air vents and reach the prison's sewer system. But first, they had to cut the iron plate covering the air vents that very night. As soon as the lights went out, Frank got to work. He cut the metal pipes in his room and connected them using screws, turning them into a makeshift tool that could cut through the plate. Meanwhile, Frank went to meet the prison's biggest inmate, Tootin. On behalf of Lenny, Frank challenged Tootin to a boxing match. On the other side, Frank and his team's plan was progressing quickly. Now they were well aware of the path, from the air vents to the drainage system. As they continued forward, they reached a river. Beyond that river was a railway station, one that could mark the beginning of their freedom. But they were well aware that those railway tracks carried a current of 650 volts. If they didn't cross them in time, they would all be electrocuted. After discussing their plan thoroughly, they decided to break out of prison 3 days later. But what they didn't know was that Tony had been watching them from above. And from their expressions, he had figured out that they were up to something big. That same night, all the inmates gathered in the canteen to watch a fight between Tootin and Lenny. Tootin was incredibly strong and started beating Lenny brutally. But the moment Lenny found an opening, he landed a powerful punch on Tootin's face, so hard that a diamond tooth popped out of Tootin's mouth. Before the guards could arrive, Lenny quickly picked up the tooth and pocketed it. Later, he attached the diamond tooth to a pipe he had crafted the previous night. The next day, in the bathroom, Tony asked Frank a few questions about their plan. When Frank gave him no answers, Tony told him to keep his room door unlocked that night, and promised to visit him. When Frank informed his companions, their confidence shook a little. They knew they couldn't mess with Tony, as he was Risa's brother, but they also knew that if they didn't act now, their entire plan would be ruined. So Frank asked for permission to bring in a new person to their team, someone who could help them in that moment. His name was Viv Batista. Batista was a prisoner who had a very specific job, delivering small amounts of drugs to inmates. But in reality, he did this in collaboration with the government, slowly reducing the doses to help prisoners overcome their addiction. Frank presented an offer to Batista. If he could help shut Tony up, in any way possible, Frank would take him with them when they escape. Batista immediately agreed, and came up with a plan to silence Tony forever. He prepared a special drug laced with poison. Quietly, he snuck it out of the lab and handed it to Frank. That evening, Frank was nervously waiting for Tony's arrival. He had Batista's drug in hand, ready to give it to Tony and end the problem for good. But unfortunately, Tony didn't come alone. He brought a friend. Tony instantly handed the drug packet to his friend. Tony had always had his eyes on Lacey, and he used the opportunity to start harassing him. But Lacey wasn't the kind to stay silent like the others. He began to beat Tony up in retaliation. Seeing this, Tony's friend panicked and ran away, but not without grabbing the drug packet on his way out. Tony, on the other hand, had been beaten so badly that he could barely walk. As he stepped out of the cell, he collapsed down the stairs and died on the spot. As soon as Risa heard about his brother's sudden death, he summoned Frank to his cell. Meanwhile, Lacey was thrown into solitary confinement for his involvement. Everyone knew Tony had died because of his own actions, but no one was willing to say it out loud. Now, only one eyewitness remained of Frank, because Tony's friend had also died by then, from consuming the poisoned drugs. Risa wanted the truth. He needed to know how his brother had actually died. So, he called Frank to his cell that very night. But little did he know, Frank and his team had already planned their prison break for that same night. The operation had already begun, with their teammates working from different rooms in the prison. Just then, Frank was told that his wife had come to visit him. She delivered the devastating news. Their daughter had died that morning in the hospital. Frank was shattered. He had been doing all this just to meet his daughter. Now, with no reason left to escape, he felt hollow inside. But after some thought, even if reluctantly, Frank jumped down into the hole they had dug in the laundry room. And now, we return to where the story began, the night all the prisoners were escaping. As they reached the air vents, Lenny pulled out the pipe he had made and started cutting through the iron plate. Once the plate was off, the drainage system was revealed. They had to crawl through those tunnels to reach the river that passed near the prison. After fighting through all odds, they finally reached the end of the sewer. There, they discovered a wall blocking the way. There was no route forward. Their entire plan seemed to fall apart. Furious, Lenny pushed Lacey against the wall and punched him hard, but Lacey dodged, and the punch hit the wall, breaking off a chunk. That's when they realized this wall had been built recently. Without wasting time, they began to break it down. After several minutes of effort, they created a hole big enough for one person to crawl through. Brody, who had the most experience with these things, volunteered to go in first and dig the way forward. But disaster struck. Just minutes in, the tunnel caved in on him. Frank quickly began digging with his hands to pull Brody out. After what felt like forever, he finally found Brody's hand. Brody was unconscious, but alive. Taking turns, they carried Brody on their shoulders as they moved forward, and finally, they reached an empty railway station. It meant they were on the right path. Lacey, despite bleeding heavily from his foot, helped as much as he could. He kept urging everyone to move forward, but suddenly, they heard dogs barking. The police were now searching for them. It was a matter of life and death. With no choice left, they had to leave their injured friend Brody behind and keep going. Next, they came across a small pond. It wouldn't have been a problem, except Lenny didn't know how to swim. Still, they somehow managed to cross the water and reach the railway tracks. Everything was going according to plan, until Batista's foot got stuck in the track. To make matters worse, a train was fast approaching. Lenny tried to save Batista, but in doing so, he too ended up on the tracks. Now only Frank and Lacey remained. At the very last second, they jumped to the side, barely avoiding the train. Then, the two of them changed their clothes at the station and said their final goodbyes. Frank was now standing at the stairs that would lead him to the streets of London. But why did Frank even escape? The truth is, when he had completely given up, he asked Lacey to escape in his place. He gave Lacey every detail of the plan and told him to run fast. And that's where the story had started, Frank heading toward Reese's cell, shouting nonsense, only to buy more time for his friends to escape. He provoked Reese so much, that in a fit of rage, Reese stabbed him with a knife. Moments later, the guards arrived to bandage him up. And in those final moments, as his condition worsened, Frank imagined himself escaping with his friends. But in reality, he had sacrificed himself, just to buy them the time they needed, to feel freedom. In the final scene, though not in reality, Frank meets his daughter on the streets of London, alive, somehow. And with that, the story ends. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. See you in the next one.